The fluorescent lights of Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School cast long shadows across the empty parking lot as Sarah Johnson gathered her belongings. Her tired eyes crinkled with satisfaction as she counted the last of the fundraising money, $2,847 for new library books. Her fifth-grade students had outdone themselves, especially little Marcus, who had sold cookies door to door in his apartment complex after his mother lost her job. The dashboard clock read 8:47 p.m. as Sarah pulled out of the school parking lot. Her ancient Toyota Camry, a graduation gift from her father 12 years ago, hummed faithfully beneath her. The thought of her father brought a familiar ache. He'd always told her that education was the key to breaking cycles, and here she was, doing exactly what he dreamed of before cancer took him too soon. Red and blue lights suddenly erupted in her rearview mirror, shattering her reflection. Sarah's heart rate spiked, but her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Keep calm, baby girl. Show your hands, move slow, and remember, you have rights." She guided her car to the shoulder, deliberately placing her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Officer James Mitchell approached, his flashlight beam dancing across her side mirror. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a friendly face that reminded Sarah of her younger brother. "Good evening, ma'am. Did you know your right taillight is out?" Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. "No, officer. I had no idea. I'll get that fixed first thing tomorrow." She reached slowly for her purse. "Would you like to see my license and registration?" The interaction started smoothly enough. Officer Mitchell even smiled when he saw her school ID badge. "Teacher, huh? My mom was a teacher. Toughest job there is." But his demeanor shifted the moment he ran her registration. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a professional mask that made Sarah's stomach knot. "Ms. Johnson, your registration expired 2 weeks ago." His voice had lost its warmth. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Sarah's hand instinctively reached for her phone, opening the camera app as she'd seen advised countless times on social media. "Officer, I can explain. I'm waiting for my next paycheck to renew it. I'm a single mother, and with my mom's medical bills." "Ma'am, I'm not interested in excuses." Officer Mitchell cut her off, his hand resting casually on his holster. "The law is the law. You're getting cited for both the taillight and expired registration." Sarah's fingers trembled as she pressed record, keeping the phone partially hidden in her lap. The night air felt suddenly cold as she stepped out, her sensible teaching flats crunching on loose gravel. She watched helplessly as Officer Mitchell wrote up not 1 but 2 citations, his earlier warmth completely evaporated. "Sign here," he said curtly, thrusting the citations toward her. "This isn't an admission of guilt, just confirming you received them. Court dates in 3 weeks." As Sarah signed, she noticed her hand was shaking. The amount on the citations made her vision blur. $275 for the registration, $150 for the taillight. That was half of what her students had just raised for their library. Driving home, Sarah's mind raced. The registration renewal would cost another $200. Her mother's oxygen tank rental was due next week. Her daughter Tanya needed new shoes for track. The math wouldn't work, no matter how she calculated it. At a red light, she noticed her mascara had run, leaving dark streaks on her cheeks. In the distance, the church marquee read, "God never gives you more than you can handle." Sarah wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered her father's favorite phrase, "This too shall pass." But as she pulled into her driveway, seeing the light in her mother's window where the oxygen machine hummed steadily, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this traffic stop was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple citation. Sarah's red pen hovered over Jamie's essay about his dream job, becoming a police officer. The irony wasn't lost on her as she glanced at the citations propped against her coffee mug, their yellow edges curling in the humid kitchen air. Her mother's oxygen machine wheezed rhythmically from the next room, a sound that had become both comforting and anxiety-inducing. "Mom?" Tanya's voice broke through her thoughts. Her 13-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, clutching a permission slip. "The track team's going to regionals next month. Coach says I have a real shot at breaking the school record." Her eyes sparkled with hope. But Sarah's heart sank as she saw the $175 participation fee printed at the bottom of the form. "Baby, let me look at the budget tonight," Sarah managed, forcing a smile. Tanya's face fell slightly. She had heard that phrase before. Last month, it had meant no new running shoes, just duct tape on the old ones. After Tanya trudged upstairs, Sarah pulled out her laptop, opening the spreadsheet that ruled her life. The numbers glared back at her. Checking account, $342.17. Savings account, $127.89. Due this week. Mother's oxygen tank rental, $225. Electric bill, $147.32. Grocery budget, $200. Car registration renewal, $200. Traffic citations, $425. She toggled between tabs, checking her online banking one more time, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. Her next paycheck wasn't for 10 days, and the tutoring center had cut back her weekend hours due to budget constraints. The kitchen window rattled as a train rumbled past their small rental house. Sarah remembered her father teaching her to count the train cars when she was little, making a game of mathematics. Now, she counted bills instead, each one a weight pressing down on her chest. Her phone buzzed. A text from the pharmacy. Reminder. Mrs. Johnson's heart medication refill due. Cost after insurance, $83.45. Sarah's hand trembled as she set the phone down. She hadn't told her mother about the citations yet. Eleanor Johnson had worked as a housekeeper for 40 years, raising Sarah alone after her father died. Now, with congestive heart failure keeping her tethered to an oxygen tank, she still tried to give Sarah money from her Social Security checks. Not this time, Mama, Sarah whispered, wiping her eyes. She opened her browser, searching for payday loans near me before catching herself. Her cousin had fallen into that trap last year and was still paying 300% interest. A loud thump from upstairs startled her. She found Tanya in her room, frustrated tears streaming down her face as she yanked at the duct tape on her running shoes. It keeps coming loose during practice, she explained, not meeting her mother's eyes. Jessica said, I run like I'm poor. Something in Sarah broke. She grabbed her car keys, drove to the nearest sporting goods store, and bought Tanya new running shoes with her emergency credit card. The $89.99 charge would put her over her credit limit, but her daughter's smile was worth the overdraft fee she knew would follow. Back home, as Sarah returned to grading papers, an email notification popped up, court date reminder, traffic citations. The school essays blurred before her as tears welled up. Among the papers, Jamie's essay about becoming a police officer stared up at her. She circled a spelling error in justice, her red pen pressing so hard it tore the paper. In a quiet kitchen, with her mother's oxygen machine keeping time like a metronome, Sarah Johnson finally allowed herself to cry, not just for the mounting bills or the unfair citations, but for a system that seemed designed to keep people like her perpetually struggling, perpetually one emergency away from disaster. Sarah smoothed her only suit, a navy ensemble from Goodwill, as she waited on the hard wooden bench outside Courtroom 3B. Her manila folder contained everything she thought would help. Bank statements, her mother's medical bills, pay stubs, and a letter from her principal praising her dedication to the school's underfunded library program. Her hands still ached from stapling all those fundraiser posters last week. All rise. The Honorable Judge William Hartford presiding. Sarah stood, noticing she was the only person of color among the morning's defendants. Judge Hartford swept in, his silver hair and black robe immaculate. His steel-rimmed glasses caught the fluorescent light as he settled into his chair, not bothering to look at those assembled before him. 3 cases preceded Sarah's. She watched as a young white man in an expensive suit, charged with his 3rd speeding violation, received a reduced fine and an understanding smile from the judge. Youth can be impetuous, Judge Hartford had remarked, but I trust you'll be more careful now. Case number 47,623, Sarah Johnson. Moving violations, the bailiff announced. Sarah approached the podium, her folder clutched to her chest. Judge Hartford finally looked up, his expression shifting subtly as he registered her appearance. The change was microscopic, a slight tightening around his eyes, a nearly imperceptible straightening of his spine, but Sarah felt it like a physical blow. Ms. Johnson, he began, examining her citations, expired registration, and defective equipment. How do you plead? Your Honor, I acknowledge the violations, but I'd like to explain my circumstances and request a payment plan. Sarah's voice shook slightly as she opened her folder. I'm a single mother and teacher, caring for my disabled mother. Ms. Johnston. Judge Hartford interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. This court is not interested in excuses. Personal responsibility isn't a part-time commitment. The law applies equally to everyone. In the gallery, A young law student's pen scratched across his notepad. Sarah could feel his intense focus on the proceedings, but she kept her eyes forward. I understand, Your Honor, Sarah continued, pulling out her bank statements. I'm requesting a payment plan so I can meet these obligations responsibly. I've already scheduled my registration renewal and repairs. If you can't maintain a vehicle properly, perhaps you shouldn't be driving one. Judge Hartford cut in. His words carried a weight that seemed directed not just at her citations, but at her very presence in his courtroom. The total fine is $875. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. The amount was more than triple the original citations. Your Honor, that's significantly more than. Plus court costs, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. Payable within 30 days. Next case. But Your Honor, the previous defendant with multiple violations. Are you questioning this court's authority, Ms. Johnson? Judge Hartford's voice could have frozen flame. That'll be an additional $200 for contempt. Pay the clerk on your way out. Next case. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her carefully prepared documents trembling in her hands. Behind her, the law student had stopped writing, his expression a mix of shock and determination. In the gallery, a few observers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others studied their phones, pretending not to notice. As she turned to leave, Sarah caught a glimpse of Judge Hartford already focused on the next case, dismissing her existence as easily as he dismissed her circumstances. The walk to the clerk's window felt like miles, each step carrying the weight of generations of similar moments, similar dismissals, similar injustices. Outside the courthouse, Sarah sat on a bench, staring at the receipt for $1,075 until the numbers blurred. A shadow fell across the paper, the law student from the gallery extending his business card. My name's Marcus Chen, he said quietly. And what just happened in there? That wasn't justice. That was something else entirely. The basement of First Baptist Church hummed with barely contained anger. Sarah sat at a folding table, surrounded by faces she'd never seen before, yet each story they shared echoed her own. Marcus Chen stood at the front, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, as he pinned another case summary to an already crowded bulletin board. In the past 6 months alone, Marcus announced, his laser pointer highlighting patterns on his makeshift chart, Judge Hartford has imposed fines averaging 320% higher for minorities compared to white defendants for identical violations. The crowd of 40-plus people murmured, some shaking their heads, others taking photos with their phones. Mrs. Rodriguez, a grandmother who cleaned offices downtown, stood up shakily. He fined my grandson $800 for a broken taillight. $800. The boy works part-time at McDonald's to help pay for his college books. Her voice cracked. When I tried to help him pay, he said no. Now he's dropped out of community college because he can't afford both. Sarah felt a hand squeeze her shoulder, Reverend Jackson's wife, who'd watched her grow up in these very pews. Child, when your daddy marched with Dr. King, he said change comes when good people get tired of being quiet. Looks like we're finally getting tired. Marcus clicked to the next slide, revealing a photograph that made Sarah gasp. It showed Judge Hartford at a country club fundraiser, arm around the CEO of Private Probation Partners, LLC. This company, Marcus explained, profits from payment plans that the judge selectively offers. The interest rates are predatory, but for some defendants, it's either that or jail time for unpaid fines. The law student who filmed Sarah's hearing, now identified as James Wong, raised his hand. The video of Ms. Johnson's hearing has over 200,000 views on social media. People are starting to ask questions about Hartford's other cases. A local reporter, Diana Martinez, sat in the back, her press badge catching the fluorescent light as she scribbled in her notebook. Sarah had been hesitant about media attention, but Marcus had convinced her that sunlight was the best disinfectant. My daughter asked me last night, Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger than she expected, why some people have different rules than others. She's 13 and she already sees it. How many more children need to learn this lesson? The room fell silent. Sarah continued, I'm not just fighting for my $1,075 anymore. I'm fighting for Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson. For everyone who's had to choose between paying an unfair fine and putting food on the table. Marcus nodded, pulling up another document. We've identified over 300 cases with similar patterns. The ACLU is interested, but they need more data. We need volunteers to go through court records, track down previous defendants, document everything. Hands shot up across the room. A retired court clerk volunteered access to public records she'd been quietly collecting for years. A statistics professor offered to analyze the data. 3 law students from Marcus's study group promised to dedicate their weekends. As people signed up for various tasks, Sarah noticed Diana Martinez approaching. "Miss Johnson, would you be willing to go on record? This story needs a face, a voice. People need to understand this isn't just about traffic tickets. It's about dignity." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Baby, Tanya just won her track meet. She broke the school record, just like she said she would. Her daddy would be so proud of both his girls." Sarah looked up at Diana, tears pricking her eyes but her voice firm. "Yes," she said, "I'll go on record. Some things are too important to stay silent about." The basement of First Baptist Church had seen many meetings over the years, civil rights gatherings, community organizing, prayer circles. But as Sarah watched people exchanging numbers, sharing stories, and building something larger than themselves, she realized this wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of a movement. Marcus's office at the Legal Aid Society looked like a conspiracy theorist's dream. Red strings connected photographs on a corkboard, sticky notes covered every surface, and bankers' boxes labeled by year lined the walls. He hadn't been home in 36 hours, sustained only by cold coffee and determination. "You need to see this," he told Sarah, spreading documents across his cluttered desk. "Remember that photo from the country club? It goes deeper." He pulled out a corporate filing. Private probation partners isn't just working with the court system. They're practically running it. Sarah leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Through the window behind Marcus, protest signs were visible in the courthouse square. "Justice shouldn't have a price tag, and Hartford must go." "Look here," Marcus pointed to highlighted sections. "Judge Hartford's son-in-law, Michael Preston, owns 30% of the company's shares. Every time Hartford denies a reasonable payment plan and forces defendants into their private probation system, his family profits." A knock interrupted them. Angela Torres, a courthouse clerk of 23 years, stepped in and quickly closed the door. Her hands shook as she placed a USB drive on Marcus's desk. "I could lose my job for this," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "But I can't sleep at night anymore. These are recordings from Judge Hartford's chambers. The things he says when he thinks no one's listening." Marcus plugged in the drive while Sarah watched the color drain from Angela's face. Hartford's voice filled the small office. "These people need to learn their place. A few thousand in fines is a cheap lesson. Better than what we had to do in my daddy's day." Sarah's stomach churned. The recording continued, revealing conversations with other judges, casual racism masked as concern for law and order, and explicit discussions about steering defendants toward private probation partners. "There's 20 years of data here," Marcus said, scrolling through spreadsheets. "The pattern is undeniable. Black and Hispanic defendants are 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines, 5 times less likely to be offered payment plans, and 8 times more likely to face contempt charges for questioning their sentences." Angela wiped tears from her eyes. Last week he fined a single mother $2,000 for expired tags. She fainted right there in the courtroom. He called it theatrical behavior and added contempt charges. Sarah remembered her own hearing, the subtle sneer in Hartford's voice. How has he gotten away with this for so long? "Fear," Angela replied, "and friends in high places." The previous court administrator tried to raise concerns. Suddenly, her daughter lost her teaching job. Her son's business licenses were under review, and her husband's contractor bids were all rejected. She transferred to another county. Marcus was already typing. "But she kept records, didn't she, Angela?" The clerk nodded. "Everything's documented. Dates, times, case numbers. She knew someday someone would be brave enough to use it." Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Tanya. "Mom, there's news vans outside our house. What's going on?" "It's starting," Marcus said, looking up from his computer. The Associated Press picked up the story. "I just got calls from 3 national news networks." Angela stood, straightening her blazer. "I should get back before I'm missed." "But Sarah." She gripped Sarah's hand. "My grandmother cleaned houses for white families. She used to say that truth is like water. It finds every crack, no matter how small, and eventually breaks even the strongest stone." As Angela left, Marcus turned to Sarah. "This isn't just about traffic fines anymore. We're looking at systemic corruption, civil rights violations, possible RICO charges. Are you ready for what comes next? Once we file these documents, there's no turning back." Sarah picked up a photo from Marcus's desk, her father at a civil rights march, young and proud, fist raised high. She thought of Tanya, of Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, of countless others who'd sat in Hartford's courtroom feeling powerless and alone. "Truth is like water," she repeated softly, then straightened her shoulders. "Let it flow." The Washington Post headline screamed across Sarah's tablet. "Justice for sale. Small-town judge's racial bias exposed." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the article in her mother's hospital room, the oxygen machine's steady rhythm a counterpoint to the chaos unfolding outside. "You're trending on Twitter, baby," her mother said weakly from the bed, managing a small smile. Eleanor Johnson had insisted on being discharged early, despite her pneumonia, saying her daughter needed her more than the hospital did. "Your daddy would have been right there with you." Raising hell. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since Diana Martinez's expose broke nationally. The local story had exploded when body camera footage emerged, showing stark differences between Officer Mitchell's initial friendly demeanor and his written report, which claims Sarah had been confrontational and uncooperative. Ms. Johnson, a producer from CNN, was on the line. "We'd like to have you on Anderson Cooper tonight. Your story's resonating with millions. People are coming forward from across the country with similar experiences." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus burst into the room, his usually immaculate tie askew. "They found the tweets," he announced, his laptop open. "Hartford's old social media posts. Thousands of them, going back years. They're bad, Sarah." The post scrolled across his screen. Racist memes, jokes about defendants' poverty, casual references to the good old days of segregation. One from just 3 months ago read, "Some people mistake mercy for weakness. A harsh fine today prevents worse behavior tomorrow. #law and order." "Mom," Tanya called from the doorway. "There's protesters outside the courthouse. My whole track team is there." She held up her phone, showing a live stream of hundreds gathering on the courthouse steps. Signs bobbed in the crowd. "Black Lives Matter in traffic court too, and Hartford's justice is bankrupt." Sarah's own words from Diana's article were being shared thousands of times. When justice has a price tag, and that price changes based on your skin color, we're not talking about law and order anymore. We're talking about oppression with a gavel. Judge Hartford's attempts at damage control only made things worse. His hastily called press conference turned disastrous when he claimed he didn't see color in his courtroom, only to have Martinez publish court statistics showing exactly how much color had influenced his rulings. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, showing her another message. "They're threatening your job." The school board had received hundreds of calls demanding her removal, claiming she was politicizing traffic violations and teaching children to disrespect authority. But for every threatening call, there were two in support. Her students' parents had organized a rally outside the school, and her principal had publicly declared, "Sarah Johnson teaches our children something more valuable than any textbook. She teaches them to stand up for what's right." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. "Remember when you were little and that boy pushed you down on the playground? You didn't just get up. You organized all the other kids to make sure he couldn't push anyone else." Sarah's phone buzzed again, a text from Angela. "Hartford's chambers are being searched. FBI just arrived." Outside, the protest chants grew louder. Sarah moved to the window, watching as more people joined the crowd. She recognized Mrs. Rodriguez, her grandson now wearing a college cheer, holding a sign that read, "Education, not exploitation." The retired court clerk was there too, surrounded by young lawyers clutching documents. Even Officer Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, his face troubled as he watched his body camera footage played on a giant screen. "What do we do now?" Tanya asked, slipping her hand into her mother's. Sarah squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of all those gathering voices, all those shared stories, all those years of silence finally breaking. "Now," she said, "we make sure they hear us." The federal courthouse gleamed in the morning sun, its marble steps crowded with news cameras and supporters. Inside Courtroom 2A, Sarah sat behind Marcus, watching Judge Evelyn Richardson study the evidence with piercing dark eyes. The first black woman appointed to the federal bench in this district, Richardson's reputation for meticulous fairness was legendary. "Your Honor," Marcus began, standing before a massive digital display. What began as a simple traffic stop has revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination spanning 2 decades. His presentation software illuminated the courtroom with color-coded graphs. "These are not mere statistics. They are stories of lives derailed by prejudice wearing a judge's robes." Hartford's attorney, a senior partner from an expensive firm, objected. "Your Honor, this is a simple appeal of a traffic citation. The defense is trying to turn this into a civil rights crusade." Judge Richardson's gaze could have cut steel. Counselor, when justice is applied unequally, every case is a civil rights case. Continue, Mr. Chen. Marcus nodded to his tech team. The display shifted to show a three-dimensional visualization of Hartford's sentencing patterns. Red dots representing excessive fines clustered dramatically around minority defendants, forming an undeniable pattern. The mathematical probability of this distribution occurring by chance, Marcus explained, is less than 1 in 10 million. But numbers alone don't tell the whole story. He gestured to the gallery, where Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson sat in his college uniform. This young man nearly lost his education. He pointed to an elderly man in a wheelchair. Mr. Wilson lost his home trying to pay Hartford's excessive fines. Finally, he turned to Sarah. And Ms. Johnson, a dedicated teacher raising her daughter alone while caring for her sick mother, faced fines that would have devastated her family. The courtroom doors opened silently. Heads turned as Angela Torres entered, still in her clerk's uniform, hands shaking but chin held high. Hartford's face went pale. Your Honor, Marcus said, we have a last-minute witness. Angela's testimony fell like thunderbolts. She played recordings of Hartford's chamber conversations, each racist comment and corrupt dealing echoing through the stunned courtroom. When she described the systematic destruction of complaint records, her voice broke. I'd watched him mock their poverty, she said, tears streaming. He would laugh about teaching them lessons, while his own family profited from their despair. Hartford's attorney jumped up. Objection. This witness is clearly biased. Like your client? Judge Richardson's voice could have frozen flame. Sit down, counselor. As Angela stepped down, she caught Sarah's eye. 2 decades of silent witness transformed into one moment of truth. Sarah reached out and squeezed her hand as she passed. Marcus delivered his closing argument with quiet intensity. Your Honor, we're not just asking for Ms. Johnson's fines to be vacated. We're asking for a complete review of Judge Hartford's cases, for restitution to his victims, and for justice that doesn't check your bank account or skin color before deciding your fate. Judge Richardson removed her glasses, studying the courtroom. Her gaze lingered on Sarah, then moved to Hartford, who seemed to have aged years during the hearing. I've seen enough, she said finally. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of systemic bias and corruption. Ms. Johnson's fines are vacated. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation of all cases presided over by Judge Hartford in the past 20 years. She leaned forward, her voice steel. Let this serve as notice. Justice is not a commodity to be sold, nor is it a weapon to be wielded against the vulnerable. This court stands adjourned. As the gallery erupted in tears and hugs, Sarah felt a weight lift, not just from her shoulders, but from generations of shoulders before her. Outside, the sun seemed brighter, the air clearer, as if truth itself had cleaned the very atmosphere. Mom, Tanya whispered, hugging her fiercely. We did it. No, baby, Sarah replied, watching the diverse crowd celebrating on the courthouse steps. We all did it together. 1 year later, Sarah stood before a different kind of audience, a packed auditorium at the state judicial conference. Her keynote speech notes trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice rang clear and strong. Change doesn't always announce itself with trumpets, she began. Sometimes it starts with a broken taillight and a woman who simply couldn't afford to stay silent anymore. In the front row, Marcus Chen sat beside Judge Richardson, both now members of the newly formed Judicial Oversight Committee. Behind them, Angela Torres, recently appointed as the court system's first civil rights compliance officer, nodded encouragingly. In the past year, Sarah continued, 317 of Judge Hartford's cases have been overturned. $2 million in excessive fines have been refunded. But numbers don't tell the whole story. She gestured to the screen behind her, where faces appeared one by one. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson just made the dean's list at state. Mr. Wilson got his house back. Officer Mitchell, who wrote my original ticket, now leads implicit bias training sessions for his department. In the audience, Officer Mitchell ducked his head, a small smile playing on his lips. His body camera footage had become mandatory viewing in police academy training sessions across the state. But true change isn't just about correcting past wrongs, Sarah said. It's about preventing future ones. She clicked to the next slide, showing the state's new judicial fairness algorithm developed by a team of civil rights attorneys and data scientists. The system flagged patterns of bias in real time before they could become systemic problems. At home, things had changed too. Sarah's mother, though still dependent on oxygen, had seen her medical debt erased by a class action settlement. Tanya, now a high school freshman, had founded a youth justice club that was already spreading to other schools. The butterfly effect tells us that small actions can have enormous consequences, Sarah continued. But it doesn't tell us which actions will spark change. That's why we must treat every moment of injustice as an opportunity for transformation. She paused, looking at the mixed crowd before her: judges, lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens. Judge Hartford's resignation wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in how we think about justice. The changes were visible everywhere. The courthouse where Hartford once presided now hosted monthly community oversight meetings. The private probation company had been replaced by a nonprofit offering interest-free payment plans and job training. Traffic fine amounts were now standardized, with ability to pay scales publicly posted in every courtroom. Last week, Sarah smiled. My daughter asked me a different question than she did a year ago. Not, why do some people have different rules? But how can I help make the rules fair for everyone? In the back of the auditorium, Diana Martinez, now a Pulitzer finalist, scribbled in her notebook. Her ongoing series about judicial reform had sparked similar investigations in 12 other states. The arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, Sarah concluded, but it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because ordinary people decide that silence costs more than speaking up, that comfort is less important than conscience, that the way things are is not the way things have to be. As the audience rose in a standing ovation, Sarah caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, a young black girl, maybe 13, watching with intense eyes. She reminded Sarah of herself at that age, when her father first taught her about justice. Later, the girl approached her with a warm copy of Diana's first article. My mom got a ticket she can't afford, she said. I want to learn to do what you did. Sarah looked into those determined young eyes and saw the future. Not just one person standing up, but an entire generation learning to bend that arc toward justice, one small moment at a time. Let me tell you about a lawyer named Marcus Chen, she began, and how a broken taillight changed everything.